Howdy, hoop heads, and welcome to another episode of Her Game, Her Voice, the podcast with big stories about women's basketball in little 15 minutes or less episodes. I'm your host, Kari Peterson. Today on the pod, I'm sharing part 3 of our WNBA at 30 How Did We Get Here series, answering a listener question about voting for WNBA All-Stars, and of course I'll wrap it all up with the awards. Now let's tip it off. Before I really jump into today's episode, I've got a quick side note. I want to give an official shout out to an extraordinary wildlife photographer and birder. His name is Rick Morris, and he's based in Northern California. Shmoopy and I recently went on one of Rick's owl tours, and it was absolutely magical. One of the highlights was spotting a juvenile owl, about 3 months old, perched on a basketball backboard. That's right, this basketball nerd went owl watching and found one on a basketball backboard. How cool is that? If you're in the Bay Area and want to experience the magic of an owl or bird tour, look up Rick Morris at inthewildwithrick.com. You will not be disappointed. Oh, and you'll be happy to know that I named that owl on the backboard Nneka Ogwumike, after the great Nneka Ogwumike, someone who is wise like an owl and definitely knows her way around a backboard. And now back to our How Did We Get Here series. Part 3 is called Belief Before Proof. Last time we looked at the battle between the WNBA and the American Basketball League, the ABL. The WNBA survived, and the ABL did not. You might think that once the competition disappeared, the WNBA was finally in the clear. It wasn't, because surviving isn't the same thing as thriving. Today, when we look at the WNBA, it's easy to think that this was always where the league was headed. Sold-out arenas, record television ratings, expansion franchises paying hundreds of millions of dollars just for the opportunity to join. It almost feels inevitable. But history tells a different story. For much of its first 2 decades, the league's future was anything but certain. Even rapid expansion in the early years didn't guarantee long-term stability. And that brings us to today's question. So who kept the dream of the WNBA alive? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. It was the NBA. The NBA supplied the funding, business infrastructure, and perhaps most importantly, the credibility the league needed to get off the ground. Without that support, it's hard to imagine the WNBA surviving those early years. But here's where the story often gets oversimplified. You'll still hear people say, the WNBA failed and the NBA had to keep rescuing it. But that's not really what happened. The WNBA wasn't launched expecting to turn a profit overnight. It was launched as a long-term investment, because that's how startup sports leagues work. Professional leagues aren't built in a few seasons. They're built over decades. The NBA understood that. Here's what I think people miss. The biggest challenge facing the WNBA wasn't about basketball. The talent was always there. The biggest challenge was perception. Every time attendance dipped, critics predicted the league was dying. Every time a franchise moved, people declared women's basketball had failed. Men's leagues have often been given decades to grow. Women's sports were expected to prove themselves almost immediately. That's an impossible standard. So who kept the dream alive? The answer? Thousands of people. People who believed in what the WNBA could become. Long before there was any proof it would. The players kept believing. For years, many of the league's biggest stars finished the WNBA season, took only a short break, then spent the winter playing overseas, just to earn enough money to keep playing professionally. Year-round basketball, very little rest, and then they did it all over again. Not because it was easy, because they believed a professional women's basketball league in the U.S. was worth building. The coaches kept believing too. They weren't just teaching offenses and defenses. They were building standards. They were building culture, credibility. As Minnesota Lynx head coach Cheryl Reeve has often said, today's success was built by generations of players and coaches who kept believing long before the rest of the basketball world caught on. And what about the team owners? Well, that story is a little more complicated. Not every owner stayed committed. But enough owners believed the league was worth investing in, even when profits weren't guaranteed, that it kept moving forward. And then there were the fans, the original season ticket holders, families, youth basketball teams, people who kept showing up, even when the national spotlight didn't. Those fans weren't simply buying tickets. They were casting votes for the future of women's basketball. Think about that for a second. Every sold-out arena we see today, every television audience that sets a new record, every expansion franchise, every little kid who now dreams of playing in the WNBA rests on the shoulders of people who kept believing, when believing required a whole lot more than faith. Today, believing in the WNBA doesn't require much faith. The arenas are full, television audiences are continuing to grow, sponsors are investing, owners are lining up, expansion teams are paying record prices just to get in. The proof is everywhere. But 30 years ago, none of that existed. There was no proof. There was only belief. Belief that someday this league could become what it is today. And maybe that's the real story of the WNBA's first 30 years. Not that success was inevitable, but that enough people believed long enough for the league to go from surviving to thriving. And with that, I'm awarding myself today's unofficial buzzer beater award for making it through an entire episode about belief without quoting Journey's Don't Stop Believing. Well, I almost made it. Next time in part 4 of How We Got Here, we'll meet one of the players who embodied that belief and brought something to the WNBA that every great sports league needs: its first dynasty and its first true superstar. And now it's time for our listener question. This week's question comes from Jordan in Seattle, who asks, how exactly are WNBA All-Stars selected? It seems like there were some pretty big snubs this year. Wonderful question, Jordan, and very timely. Every year in July, fans start debating who made the All-Star team and who didn't. Here's how the voting works. First, the 10 starters are chosen through a weighted voting system. Fans make up 50% of that vote. Current WNBA players account for 25%, and a media panel makes up the final 25%. Everyone votes for 4 guards and 6 front court players. Once those votes are combined, the top 4 guards and top 6 front court players are named All-Star starters. After that, the process changes. The 12 reserves are selected entirely by the league's head coaches. Coaches vote for 3 guards, 5 front court players, and 4 wildcards, and they can't vote for players on their own teams. So remember, not being voted as starter doesn't mean a player won't make the All-Star team. More than half the roster is actually selected later by the coaches as reserves. Now, about those snubs. This year's biggest controversy involved the player vote. Caitlin Clark was ranked as just the 11th best guard in the league by her fellow players, despite ranking near the top with both fans and the media. Then ESPN reported that fewer than half of eligible WNBA players actually submitted ballots, meaning a relatively small number of votes had an outsized impact on the player rankings. So it's really no surprise that All-Star voting sparks debate every year. Fans, players, media members, and coaches all value different things. And one more fun fact about this year's All-Star game. Because the WNBA is celebrating its 30th season, they're doing something they've never done before. Instead of having the top 2 fan vote getters serving as team captains, the league has handed the keys to 2 absolute legends, Cynthia Cooper and Teresa Weatherspoon. If those names sound familiar, they should. Cynthia Cooper was the league's very first MVP, and Teresa Weatherspoon hit one of the most iconic shots in WNBA history. They're 2 pioneers who helped build the league, making them fitting honorary general managers for this year's celebration. Each will draft a team from the full pool of 22 All-Stars. So yes, there will always be debate about who got snubbed. But in the WNBA's 30th season, it's also a celebration of the women who made today's league possible. And that, my dear hoopheads, is pretty cool. And now it's time for the awards. This week's Buzzer Beater Award goes to Indiana Fever coach Stephanie White for reminding us that you can demand accountability for an incident on the basketball court and also defend the humanity of everyone involved in that incident. By now, I'm sure you've heard about the thing that happened during last month's Fever Mercury game. You know, the one involving Alyssa Thomas and Caitlin Clark. After the league retroactively upgraded the play to a flagrant 2, emotions boiled over. Fans were calling on WNBA Commissioner Kathy Engelbert and the league to make a statement as the story dominated headlines. But as the backlash against Alyssa Thomas escalated into online abuse, death threats, and hateful rhetoric, it was Stephanie White who stepped up first. During an intense press conference, White passionately condemned the toxicity, racism, and homophobia directed at Alyssa Thomas. She made it clear that criticism of a basketball play is one thing, but threats and hate have no place in the game. She also said that the people spreading that abuse weren't representing the WNBA or Indiana Fever fans. They were simply using this moment to push their own divisive agendas. Congratulations, Coach White, on your well-deserved Buzzer Beater Award. And now, the Airball Award. This week's Airball Award goes to the WNBA officiating crew from last month's Fever Mercury game. Look, their job is to make calls in real time. Unfortunately, they missed one of the biggest calls of the night. The league later reviewed the play, upgraded Alyssa Thomas's foul to a flagrant 2, fined her, and suspended her for 1 game. That retroactive decision quickly became one of the biggest stories in the WNBA, spilling out of sports media and into the mainstream. Now, we'll never know whether making the correct call during the game would have changed everything that followed. But what we do know is that the officials missed a play the league later determined warranted a flagrant 2. And let's be honest, the WNBA didn't need another high-profile example of questionable officiating. And that's why this week's Airball Award goes to the officiating crew from last month's Fever Mercury game. And finally, the Flagrant Foul Award. This week's Flagrant Foul Award goes to the people who crossed the line from criticism into threats and harassment. Look, if you want to criticize Alyssa Thomas for what happened in that Fever Mercury game, that's fair. The league reviewed the play, upgraded it to a flagrant 2, fined her, blah, blah, blah. That's basketball. But sending racist messages, making death threats, and harassing someone over a basketball play? That's not basketball. Alyssa Thomas is a human being. You don't have to like what she did. But no player deserves to be threatened or dehumanized over a game. Women's basketball has worked too hard to build this community. We can't let hate become part of it. Congratulations, haters. You've won this week's Flagrant Foul Award. I'm Kari Peterson, and you've been listening to Her Game, Her Voice. Want more? Hit follow or subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And while you're on the show page, please drop a rating or review and share an episode with a friend. Thanks for listening, and happy hoopin'!